So I read Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. My feelings are mixed. What I will say, first of all, is that this book is completely a victim of circumstance. Any book that I read after The Book Thief was going to have a lukewarm reception from me, because personally, The Book Thief was a transformative 5-star masterpiece that blew my face off. And order effects, you know, this is something that happens in psychology all the time. That's why when people do studies, they counterbalance to get rid of order effects. It was always going to happen. I went into this with cognitive bias. Having said that, there are larger issues with this book that I think, had I read it at any point, I would have problems with. I find it perplexing that the book is called Mexican Gothic, but it's not very Mexican and it's not very Gothic. And the Gothic quality especially, to begin with, I was kind of feeling it, but then as the book progresses, it gets far too steeped in body horror. And the twist as well felt very science fiction. Like, it was going in directions that I didn't expect from it. And I feel like, had it stuck on the straight and narrow of a Gothic horror, give me ambience, give me vibes, make it spooky, I would have liked it a lot more, because the first 100 pages I thought, oh, this is quite good. Like, I could get into this. And then as soon as the twist happened and the hallucinations, I was like, no, you've gone into the weeds. It didn't help as well that the book is so modern in its writing style. Like, the tone for me, there was a disconnect. Gothic, when I think of Gothic, I immediately think of, like, years and years ago. Like, not even, like, decades, like, maybe even centuries ago. Like, it should feel very sort of a time beyond what is happening now. And so the book, I don't know, it felt so contemporary. It upset for me what I think of as Gothic. And I think that's partly because there's a sense of inspiration in this. Like, it quotes, like, Wuthering Heights, and, like, it's clear that the writer loves Gothic literature, but I don't know if it comes across as its own enjoyable Gothic story. It also felt very young adult, which is weird because there are so many adult themes in the book. So for the writing style itself to feel adolescent, I was left with a sense of, like, who is this for? Is this for teenagers that want an edgier story than maybe what they're used to? If so, then I wish it wasn't as sexually charged, because there are moments where it's definitely not appropriate for teenagers. But then if it's for adults, why is the writing style so, for want of a better word, basic? I went with my mum to the hospital the other day to get an iron infusion. And while she was having it, I was sitting there with her, keeping her company, and I decided to read some of the book to her. And I think we must have got through a couple of chapters or something, and then her iron infusion was done. She was like, Alfie, that sounds like a bad book. So you see where I get my strong opinions from. But I don't disagree. There's something about the way the third act comes in. It just felt a bit... It didn't happen as organically as I would have liked it to. And maybe that's a pacing issue. If you've slapped on another 100 pages to this to sort of flesh out the tropes and the things, so that when there is the big twist, which I'm not going to reveal, of course, because spoilers, but if there had been a bit more care, a bit more of a gentle touch to lead us in a way so that when the twist is revealed, you can look at all these other things and say, oh, wow, that makes sense. Because if you've read, is it The Trouble with Lichen? There's like a John Wyndham novel that has a very similar premise to what happens in this. But as I said, it was so corporealized, it just didn't feel Gothic to me. Like, I think Gothic horror is more ethereal. It's like ghosts and curses and things that have been there for hundreds of years. This was so in the sort of body and the flesh of it all. And that, for me, just didn't feel like it was in the pocket of Gothic, which was strange because it's Mexican Gothic. I also think it was a very big missed opportunity to really get into the interracialness of it all, because in this story there are like two families. There's the Doyles, this white family that have settled in Mexico. They have this big like mansion, and they're marrying these like Mexican sisters. Like there's Catalina, who is married to Virgil, and then the main character Noemi, who comes into it. She's like not planning to marry any of them, but you know, things happen. But there's little whisperings of eugenics and like superior races, and it doesn't go fully into it, and I wish that it had, because the whole time I'm kind of like, what's the scoop here? You know, not every book has to have this big profound message, but then why mention it at all? You know, like if you're going to have this blonde hair, blue-eyed family, and then this more traditional, darker skinned Mexican family, and they're coming together in the same household, explore that a bit. What are the cultural differences? What are things that, you know, the white family take for granted living in Mexico? Like actually get into the minutiae of Mexican culture, folklore. Like if it had been a spirit and it had been something that is a traditional creature in Mexican culture, would have loved it. Would have been educational, would have taught me about like the mythos of the Americas, because I don't know much about that. It would have been a more interesting thing than what happens here, where, as I said, it's almost science fiction, the way that it explains what's going on with the hallucinations and what's going on with the father, the like Mr. Doyle, who's dying but is also not. I found the relationships between the characters a bit strange as well, in the sense that they just didn't feel earned. So the two brothers, there's two blonde, blue-eyed brothers, the Doyles. You've got Virgil Doyle, you've got Francis Doyle. Virgil, the older brother, is like a bad boy, and then Francis is like the sort of nice soft boy. You know, it was very like Vampire Diaries, because they're both interested in her, the main girl, even though they've only just met her, like they've only had a handful of conversations with her. It doesn't really feel fully realised, and Catalina, the sister, kind of gets left to the wayside, like we barely see her. Like I get that she's sick with TB, but then maybe give us flashbacks to explain how this all came to fruition. I don't know, it felt a bit weird, and what happens at the end with who ends up with who, there wasn't enough going on to justify it for me. So, final thoughts on Mexican Gothic. It's not a bad book. I would recommend it if you're into the sort of more book talky style books, you know, things like the Shatter Me series, things like Fourth Wing. If you're into those kind of vibes, sure. But if you're like a conventional horror lover, I feel like you might be disappointed. The storytelling itself was not bad. I would read another book by this author, but I think it would depend what the book is on, because I feel like there were mixed signals here, and it didn't deliver on what you think the book's going to be on based on like the premise Mexican Gothic. It's just, I didn't get that at all.